Thank you.
Yeah.
A lot of people are waiting.
In some of them.
A lot of the diaspora.
Yeah, but in Afghanistan, it's too late now.
No, I mean from
Canada and different countries. Yeah,
like
there.
Some people from Germany and
Germany.
the Netherlands also.
Okay.
I think.
Thank you. Nice to meet you. Thank you. Nice to meet you too.
That's a good job. Go ahead, go ahead.
meeting ID.
So is it tomorrow that you're going to California?
Yeah, afternoon. I have the morning off.
Great.
Great. Yeah.
Sleep in.
Yeah. I have breakfast and then I leave. I go to the airport around 1 o'clock. Yeah. 12:30, 1 o'clock. Yeah.
How long are you going to be in California?
Only taking the red eye flight back on Tuesday night. I arrive Wednesday morning in New York early. I think there's a few coming from here. I only know Anifa's coming and Prishta Saki. I think she's coming to California.
Okay, okay.
I don't know who else they're bringing from DC.
Okay, okay. Yeah. Are they going to have like a town hall or
I
community?
think the guy who's AAF, Mustafa. I think he's in California. He's coming as well to California. Yeah. But he's not here today. He might have already gone.
I see. Mustafa is very active in the Afghan diaspora.
He's arranged to have a dinner with through Hanifa, who seems to be his friend there. They're apparently we're having dinner on Sunday. So yeah.
Yeah, he did a mapping of Afghan diaspora organizations a few years ago, which was very helpful.
Good. There's a couple of people who told me they were coming and I can't see them here. So I'm not sure.
Let me check with Zubaida if she's coming.
I'm just going to check out.
We will take some questions from.
I have no idea what the questions are, just to say. We have not choreographed. I don't know what she's going to ask me.
No, about the audience, the virtual people, they will ask questions.
Yeah, yeah. From there, yeah, maybe they'll ask questions.
از آقای متیولا ویساک چیز نشنیدین؟
Yeah.
هنوزم پیششان است.
یک بیادرش سیف است و توانای کمرای دقنایزشن دیگه بیادرش
list of charges طولانی شده میرن نه؟ It's dangerous.
یک چیزی نشر کردم معاون ریاست استخبارات بخش ایان
good now?
Yeah. Okay. جوان ساکر clearly the Twitter نوشته که Afghanistan is no more a place for protest, freedom of speech.
Oh,
I have
really?
that. I will send it.
Please send it to
He
me.
tweeted that no more like that, no sit-in,
Yeah.
no protest. If someone is doing that, they will be like treated as a revolt.
Wow.
Ah.
Nawajam.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Nawa Arsalaluddin. I'm on the board of directors of Women for Afghan Women, and thank you to everyone that's joining us virtually.
My name is Huda Nisa Faryad. I'm also on the board of Women for Afghan Women. Thank you so much for coming, and we're hoping for a fruitful conversation today.
Women for Afghan Women has over 2 decades history in Afghanistan and the United States serving the Afghan community. So we're delighted to be hosting this conversation in a country where free speech is celebrated, and our hearts are with the Afghans in Afghanistan and here.
The Afghan American Foundation is a newly developed organization working to address the issues of Afghan Americans here, but also bring awareness to what's going on for our Afghans across the world as well. And to further the conversation in this program, we're going to turn it over to Mustafa Bobak, who is the executive director at AAF, to further along explain what our program is going to be like today. So thank you so much for coming.
Not hearing.
We can hear.
We can't hear.
AAF is a nonprofit organization established in 2020 with the main mission to advance and elevate the voices of Afghan Americans in the United States through principled advocacy, education, research, and community mobilization. One way we do our work is to create such spaces for dialogue and conversation on topics that are of utmost importance to our constituents, to our communities in the United States. And I'm so delighted to have co-sponsored with our good friends at Women for Afghan Women to host this event. And we are extremely honored and privileged to have Mr. Richard Bennett to give his valuable time to our community. This is an opportunity for our community to get the latest on human rights situation in Afghanistan, but also ask questions and share concerns and comments and interest in this space. So with that, I'll pass it on to Belquis John from USIP, but also a very staunch champion and advocate of human rights and women's rights in our community, to introduce our guest speaker and moderate this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mustafa, and good afternoon. Happy 9th day of Ramadan. It's almost over. And happy Friday. Thanks for joining today's community discussion with the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Afghanistan, Mr. Richard Bennett. Today's discussion is on the record. We will hear from Richard about his recent report and trip to Afghanistan. Richard, I have prepared a few questions that I'm going to ask you. But let me first introduce you. You do not need an introduction. For those of you who know Richard only as a special rapporteur for human rights in Afghanistan, he has a very long, distinguished experience in the human rights field. Richard has served in Afghanistan on several occasions in different capacities, including as the chief of the Human Rights Service with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA. Richard has also served with the United Nations as the representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and head of the human rights components of peacekeeping operations in Sierra Leone, Timor-Leste, and South Sudan. From 2007 to 2010, Mr. Bennett was the representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Nepal and head of Office of High Commission of Human Rights Office there. He has also been Chief of Staff for the UN Secretary General's panel of experts on Sri Lanka and Special Advisor to the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights in New York. Just to set the scene here, can we fix this, please?
Just click on stay muted, then.
Yeah, we're good? Okay. It's almost 20 months since the Taliban forcefully took power in Afghanistan. Since then, all three branches of the government have merged into a single authority, all in the hands of the Taliban and their appointed mullahs. The country's constitution is revoked. The duties of the entire lawmaking body are now in the mercy of one elusive person and his most dreaded Ministry of Propagation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. Since forcefully taking power, the Taliban have issued 96 decrees infringing on the rights of women, men, and children. Of these decrees, more than 60 are related to women and girls. In Taliban's Afghanistan, women and girls are banned from education, employment, freedom of movement, and of expression. Taliban's policies undermine women's roles and deprive them of their dignity, rights, and status at home and in the society. Today, Afghanistan ranks 7th in the world for risk of mass killing of civilians. Richard, I would like to start by asking you to tell us about your mandate, your resources, as well as your limitations. And if you can also talk about your most recent trip, the highlights of your visit to Afghanistan. I'm hoping that most of you here and also the audience, virtual audience, have read your reports in English, Dari, and Pashto. We are grateful that you made it possible that your report be translated into Dari and Pashto as well. So without further ado, I'm going to give it to you, and please tell us about your mandate.
Thank you, Belquis. Salam alaikum to everyone, and thank you for coming during the afternoon during Ramadan. So I know that's probably not easy, and I appreciate your coming. And many thanks to Women for Afghan Women and Afghan American Foundation for kindly hosting this meeting. I'm delighted to be here. About my mandate. So the Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council, which is based in Geneva, after the Taliban took over, established this new mandate, a new mechanism on human rights for Afghanistan. There was some discussion even before the Taliban took over because of the, particularly because of the attacks that had been taking place in Kabul in the last few months of the Republic, and especially attacks on girls' schools, which, and not just girls' schools, maternity hospital, for example. And so there was a feeling the UN needed to do more, and it established this role of special rapporteur. It took about 6 months to be appointed, so actually tomorrow is 1 year since I was appointed, 1st of April last year. I applied, like it's not a job, it's more like standing for office. I have to be elected by the member states of the Human Rights Council. I think the US did vote for me, so I'm elected by the member states. I'm independent because I don't report to the Secretary General or the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I report to the member states. The mandate itself has 3 or 4 different parts. The first is to make assessments of the human rights situation in Afghanistan and recommendations for how to improve it. I also have a documentation mandate. I'm to seek, receive, examine and act on information about human rights and document and preserve information about violations of human rights in Afghanistan. I'm also required or strongly encouraged to integrate a gender perspective, child rights approach, and survivor-centered approach. And also to work, it says assist and advise civil society, but I actually think it's the other way. Civil society assists and advises me, I hope. And to also keep in mind all of the international human rights treaties Afghanistan has ratified, to kind of support the implementation of those treaties. So that's the mandate. I have been to Afghanistan twice on official missions. Of course, as Belquis has mentioned, I've lived in Afghanistan for a few years, actually. But I've been on 2 official missions. First was end of May, the second was end of October. And I'm hoping to go again soon to Afghanistan, not during Ramadan. During these missions, I was received at a pretty high level by the Taliban authorities. I met with 2 of the deputy prime ministers, the foreign minister several times, they're acting other different ministers, provincial governors, and so on. And I was told I was welcome to go. I wasn't restricted. I was welcome to go where I wanted. And the first visit I went to Balkh and to Kandahar. And the second visit I went to Bamiyan and to Panjshir. I'm only allowed to make about 10, 12-day visits. That's, that can't be a long visit. That's the rule. But I haven't been restricted, and I haven't been, no one has told me what I should say. My 2 reports, as Belquis says, are online. They're translated into Dari and Pashto. The UN does not do that, as a matter of course. I managed to raise some resources separately from the UN to do that. I just want to say I get some support from the UN. I have a team. You asked about resources. So on the UN side, the first year, I'm now starting the second year. The first year I had 4 UN staff to help me, plus 1 extra one UN women. The 4 staff are in Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights and 1 from UN Women. This year I should get 2 more staff. In addition to that, I've established another base, actually in Sweden, at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for International Human Rights and Human Rights Law, and so I'm now living in Sweden, and they have an Afghanistan program, and with that come 4 research fellows, and one of them is in the room. Hanifa Girawal is with me today. We're also able to run some roundtables and conferences, and we've done one which was on prospects for accountability in Afghanistan. I brought the report with me. I don't have many copies, hard copies, but it's online as well. What are the limitations? Well, the limitations are that it's not easy to do human rights monitoring in Afghanistan these days because of the very great restrictions. I think all of you. I'm not going to go into really describing all the limitations and restrictions, but because you know that already. But my limitations are how often I can go to Afghanistan and how many resources, because I don't have people in the country. I can go in and out. I can take people with me, but I don't have people based there. And also the difficulty I have because, of course, if people talk to me, I need to make sure that they are safe. That's really important. And these days, it's, we've seen how people who talk to members of the international community can run into difficulties. So those are some limitations, but I do have strong networks and a lot of people who provide me with information online. I do a lot of Zoom meetings with Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan. I've especially been meeting with Afghan women's groups. I lost count how many meetings I have. It would be in the hundreds of meetings, and I try not to meet once, but to be regularly available. Even this week, I came to for 2 reasons. I'm hosted now by USIP, but earlier in the week by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and so had meetings there on with Afghan women, but also an event on the issue of education for women and girls and in Afghanistan. The reports, you may have read them. They're pretty general. The issues I've highlighted, of course, are rights of women and girls. I've also highlighted the issue of civil and political rights, the issue of disappearances and killings and torture, the fact that the amnesty is not genuine. I focus quite a lot on rights of minorities, especially religious and ethnic minorities, but also other kinds of minorities, people with disabilities, LGBTIQ community, and so on. The rule of law issue I gave some attention to in the more recent report, an analysis of how the judicial system is or is not working in Afghanistan these days, and not forgetting economic and social and cultural rights. We hear a lot about the humanitarian crisis or the economic crisis. What I've tried to do is reframe that into human rights terms. So instead of, and to try and explore this nexus between humanitarian and human rights, because a humanitarian crisis is a human rights crisis. If you don't have access to food, enough food or water, you're living in poverty, you can't have an adequate standard of living, you can't have access to healthcare, education, all of these things. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. You talked about highlighting the issue of education in your report. You've probably heard about what happened last Monday. Longtime advocate of education in Afghanistan, Mr. Matiullah Wisa, was detained by the Taliban, and he remains in detention. His crime was that, according to the Taliban, that his crime is that he supported education for girls and boys at the very grassroots level, village level. This is not the first time this has happened, unfortunately, that an activist and educationist has been detained by the Taliban, and unfortunately it's not going to be the last time either. Where does this stop? Is there a red line for the UN and the UN members, especially those who uphold human rights values and basic human rights to education?
Well, just to say that you're absolutely right, Belquis, this is not the first, or probably not the last time. The detention of Matiullah has really hit the headlines, as it should. People have been very outspoken and outraged that he is a very well-known promoter of education, especially for girls, but for boys too. And but we know how many members of civil society have been arrested and detained, especially women protesters, but also other people who have been promoting education. There are several who are still detained, and there was also a professor who was released recently after Mashal, Professor Ismail Mashal. So this is not the first time, and of course it's completely unacceptable. I think a lot of complaints are that the international community makes some noise, but doesn't seem to have very much leverage to actually release people. And that's to some degree, I think, the case, but I am aware that behind the scenes, UN agencies or UN on the ground do work to get people released. Sometimes behind the scenes, I mean, I sometimes tweet and make statements about these things as well, but what you don't know about is what I'm doing in terms of negotiating. But I wouldn't say it's easy or particularly successful. And I think you, Belquis, in your introduction mentioned the PVPV, the vice and virtue. But alongside that, the intelligence, the GDI, is also responsible for a lot of this. In terms of what sticks does the international community have to put pressure on the Taliban, I personally think that needs to be explored a lot more. We do hear something about sanctions, and we saw the EU slap sanctions on a couple of Taliban a couple of weeks ago. There are around 135 Taliban leaders who are sanctioned by the Security Council. But I think this is an area that could be explored more. It's not really my area. I wouldn't say it's directly human rights, so I don't want to go into that too much. But yeah, the international community needs to get serious. My main interlocutors in Afghanistan and outside are Afghans, women and men, and my priority is to listen to them and to express what they say. I mean, they can say it for themselves, but also I can amplify it to members of the international community, because I get to make reports and I get to speak at conferences and to speak to the UN directly.
I'm interested to hear what the Taliban's reaction has been to your report, but I'm also interested to know whether there is political will in the UN Security Council to put pressure on the Taliban and take them accountable for their actions or inactions.
The Taliban has had two separate and different reactions to my report. So as a matter of practice, I have shared my draft report with them and also with the permanent representative of Afghanistan to the UN in Geneva, who is still accredited, though was part of the Republic, and received their comments. And they provided comments, including the Taliban have provided comments. And in the last report, I was even able to incorporate some of their comments, and they were relatively constructive, actually, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Taliban. So from that degree, it appears that they take it somewhat seriously, in that they read the report and they prepare some comments. In public, in the media, they have been much more critical, and just this, as with the same with the UNAMA reports and other reports, they have kind of dismissed it. But again, behind the scenes, they've provided some kind of constructive. In terms of the political will in the Security Council, well, I don't work much with the Security Council. I work with the Human Rights Council. I do report to the General Assembly. I'm asked to report to the Human Rights Council this year twice in writing, once orally, and to the General Assembly once. But I do engage with the members of the Security Council when I go to New York, and I talk to them in terms of a political will. I think one thing that we could note is that they've issued quite a number of strong statements on Afghanistan. They have mandated UNAMA, which includes a pretty good mandate on human rights and rights of women, rights of children. Recently, last week I think it was, they had another resolution where they've asked for an assessment, an independent assessment of the UN in Afghanistan by November. I think it's beyond UNAMA, but certainly including UNAMA. There's not much detail. It's over to the Secretary General to get that going. I think the two main points was they requested the Secretary General to make this assessment by November this year.
Thank you. How do we challenge the climate of impunity in Afghanistan? This has been going on for decades. It did not start with the Taliban, and it hasn't ended with the Taliban. But the more impunity continues, the more we will see violations of human rights of all Afghans, Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks. From your experience in Afghanistan and also other countries, tell us, how do we end this impunity?
I mean, there have to be consequences for crimes. If you don't have consequences, the crimes are going to continue and they're going to intensify. And that's what we've seen in Afghanistan, Belquis, you've mentioned for decades, for 45 years or more. It's not just the last 2 years. It goes back a long way. Many of us have been calling for tackling impunity and broader transitional justice measures for a long time. So yes, it's absolutely necessary. Is it happening? It might be. We know, for example, that the International Criminal Court has resumed its investigation into Afghanistan since October last year. I have reason to believe that they're serious and that they're moving this time. It has been extremely frustrating for me, as well as I expect for you, that the criminal court for a decade or more seems to have been doing something, but without actually producing anything. And I know many Afghans who've made submissions and have high expectations for this court. I think finally they might do something. I think they are doing something. So let's see. They don't, you know, it's done confidentially, so we don't know exactly what they're investigating. But I do think that that we will see some people held to account in the International Criminal Court. We hope that there might be universal jurisdiction cases as well, if we're talking about criminal activity. We know that some countries are looking into this, including Germany, for example. And there was also a case recently in the Netherlands where a Dutch soldier was found guilty, and the Netherlands government paid compensation to the communities affected in Uruzgan province. So it's important that it's not only the Taliban or Daesh who are held accountable, but all parties to the conflict who committed human rights violations that are held accountable. There's a case in Australia, which is one is universal jurisdiction, which I need to universal jurisdiction is where a country prosecutes someone outside their country, say in Afghanistan, for a crime, an international crime. So it may be an Afghan who's prosecuted in say, Germany. Then there are national inquiries, and you're right, Belquis, Australia just charged the first one with first of its soldiers with murder as a war crime. It's the first time ever in Australia for some killings that were captured on videos that you may have seen in Uruzgan province also. And that was a couple of weeks ago. Yeah.
I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then we will turn to all of you and also to the audience on Zoom. This is about the double standard of the international community. We have witnessed a strong and firm response to human rights violations in Ukraine. But when it comes to Afghanistan, the responses have been issuing statements, sympathy, condemning Taliban's actions, and so on. What needs to be done by the human rights community and also by Afghans to make the international community accountable for the double standards that they have? I feel the pain of the Ukrainians. Afghans have been through many, many years of war and invasions by the Soviets. Sometimes I hear from Afghans whether the Afghans' blood is not red enough. Community responsible, that Afghans' lives matter too.
I think we did, you're right. We saw that the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, and as it's gone on, we've seen the international community act much more quickly and with much more sympathy and support for Ukrainians than we saw with Afghanistan. I think it's clear, even we saw, I mentioned just now, the International Criminal Court, and they already indicted Putin. That was relatively quick. I think that, and there are serious investigations going on in Ukraine, even as the war continues. I think just a personal experience, because I'm not so familiar with the US. because I live in Europe. But I remember going to London about 1 year ago and going in through the airport in, I forget the name, the one south of London, the other one. Gatwick. And came out from the first thing when you came out with your luggage, in front of me was a big desk with a big banner in yellow and blue, which said, welcome to Ukrainians. Come and get help here. And I just thought, well, that's really great, but did they do that for Afghans? Of course not. So I think you've mentioned there are double standards. I think probably many people in whether it's in the US or in other countries would be, horrified to be accused of double standards. But I think it seems to be the case, even when it comes to certain policies and laws around resettlement. And I'm sure many of the people in the audience and online have experienced this as well. And part of my role, I have an information collection role, analysis, and advocacy. So I want to try and put the spotlight on the situation in Afghanistan. I'm only one person, so I look for the support of the media to help me do this. But I try to go to as many meetings with politicians. I've been to the Hill this week. I've talked to the US government. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to the European Parliament to try and keep Afghanistan on the front page. There's really two parts of my work, is collecting the information, analyzing it, putting it in the official UN reports that I write, and then going out and talking about it.
Thank you for doing that. Last question from my side is the gender persecution versus gender apartheid. There has been a number of campaigns launched by Afghans and friends of Afghan men and women calling for bringing Taliban to justice for committing crimes of gender persecution. If you could tell us about the two different crimes. Is gender apartheid a recognized crime? Do the Taliban's treatment of Afghan women fall under the definition of apartheid? Good definition. What Taliban are doing to Afghan women and girls. Well,
I think, Belquis, that it's not either or. They're not competing, gender persecution or gender apartheid. They are complementary. They are different, and they ought to both be working together. I'll just very briefly explain the difference between the two. So gender persecution has been an international crime for 20 years. It is included as a crime in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So it's a crime. Individuals can be prosecuted for gender persecution, but this says something about how importantly does the international justice system take women's rights. If statute for 20 years, but there's been very few or almost no prosecutions. I think the first come up. But anyone can be charged. And recently, the criminal court issued its new policy on gender persecution. It was actually in December last year. And they're not saying they're going to make Afghanistan the priority, but I do note that when the prosecutor launched this policy, there was a panel of people invited, and I was invited, and was able to speak about Afghanistan at the launch of the policy in the presence of the prosecutor of the ICC. And I was the only representative, kind of a representative of a country. think this is being taken seriously. Gender apartheid, on the other hand, is an important political concept. It's not yet a crime in international law. Apartheid is a crime in international law. But apartheid, according to the law, must be on the ground of race. The law does not include a ground of gender. Now, women first raised this issue of gender apartheid back in the 1990s, and of course, quite rightly, are raising it again now. So it's an important concept that may become law in the future with the advent of human rights and women's rights advocates. And more people are starting to use this language, and you may have noticed I have used this language. I'm not sure if other UN officials have used it yet, but I have, and including in the Human Rights Council. So I'm for both, but one can be prosecuted now, and the other will take longer. Now, another difference is gender apartheid is something not that an individual does necessarily; it's what a state does. So, as in South Africa, it was the state that was accused of apartheid, and therefore there are different kinds of responsibilities that attach to the notion of gender apartheid than to gender persecution.
Thank you so much. Very helpful. I believe we have some questions online as well. Why don't we take 3 questions from the floor, and then Mustafa Babak will gather a few questions from online and bring it up. Zafar Jan Shuma, and then Yalda Jan.
Sure. Is there a mic, or should I turn my radio voice on? I can use that mic that you have there, Ms. Jan.
Oh, that's a long process. Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna pitch a little bit up. My name is Zafar Hashimi. I'm a special advisor for the U.S. Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, known as SIGAR. 2 questions for you. First of all, thank you for that presentation. So the first question is about your second report and the mechanism and methodology, as well as access to the people in situations and instances in Afghanistan. Because when you first issued your first report, the entire Taliban machinery, propaganda machinery, and public affairs were after you to discredit your report. So how did it influence writing, drafting, and having you access for your second report, especially their interaction and their authority to allow you to go to places and talk to people? So that's my first question. And second question is about conditionality of aid. You talked about sanctions. Has it been effective at all? What measures, what leverages the international community has to ensure that the Taliban continued not to be unhinged and are accountable in one way or other?
Great, thank you. If it's okay with you, we're going to take
3.
a couple of more questions. Yalda Jan Shuma.
Hi, Chad.
Hi, Yalda.
I have very simple questions. My first question is, what is the impact of the 2 reports that you have issued? Any actions taken in result of that? Any changes happened in the life of people in Afghanistan? I'm not a fan of humanitarian aid, so I would like to hear your response on human rights. And my second question is that there are rumors that Taliban are taking money in return to release of the women protesters. Is that true? Are you aware of something like that? And if that is true, how that impact on continuation of the detention of protesters?
Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Sawala de Gas? Yes, Sheila.
I'm Sheila from Voice of America.
Sheila.
Following up with Zafar, the credibility of the sources you get the information about the human rights abuses is underreported. How much credible sources you have from Afghanistan that you get all the right information? A lot of abuses is underreported. I saw your report as well, the second report, and as also Yelda John brought it up, how much it makes impact and how you can still get the right information and bring it up to the international community so they can remember Afghanistan.
Thank you. You're all very clever because Belquis gave you 3 questions and we got 6 questions, or 2 from each. But I'll try to answer. Yeah, I can tell. Zafar Hashimi. When I went back to Afghanistan after delivering the first report, I think it's fair to say that when I had meetings with some of the Taliban officials, they expressed disappointment that I had not given what they thought was a fair or balanced picture. But nevertheless, they continued to allow me to go to where I wanted to go. And in the second, not in the first mission so much, but in the second mission, I said, I want to go to Panjshir, and they didn't stop me. So maybe that's something. I am careful about who I talk to. I've been criticized because you went to Panjshir, but you didn't see civil society. Well, I was not going to put civil society at risk by meeting me in Panjshir. But there are other ways to meet civil society from Panjshir, and I used those ways. So I did meet members of civil society. The conditionality of aid. I have referred to this in both of my reports. I was, and I think frankly, other people were surprised that when I went to meetings with Afghans, members of civil society, particularly in Afghanistan, especially in the first mission, but the second one as well, I didn't raise the issue, and yet one of the highest priorities for Afghans was this aid is going to the wrong people. It's not going to those who need it most. The people either on grounds of incompetence or deliberately, but somehow the people who ought to be at the front of the queue, who were elderly people or children or people with disabilities or people from ethnic minorities, were not getting the aid, and a lot of allegations that it was being siphoned off and controlled by the Taliban under the very noses of the humanitarian agencies, or even possibly with their complicity. So I think it's a big issue, and I have been advocating for independent monitoring and evaluation of the distribution of aid. I also think there ought to be independence, including Afghans, involved in the planning of the delivery of aid. So I believe that the aid agencies and the UN humanitarian system ought to include civil society. There is something called a WAG, a Women's Advisory Group to the humanitarian country team. But I would like them to be upfront, to be really involved in everything, to give more confidence about that. Yalda, impact of the reports, and the other question. Hard to tell what impact there's been on Taliban policy, hard to tell. But what I do know is that there's an impact in what different states are saying. I see my report, language from my report integrated into UN resolutions, exactly the same language. So I know they've read it and they've put that in speeches given by different countries in the Human Rights Council General Assembly. I've heard my language used again and again. So in some way, it's influencing the advocacy, the messaging of the member states. I'm not sure that's a huge change, but I think it does it does help to frame the international community's response. I have had some responses from the Taliban. I also, I mentioned they comment on my drafts, but you can look online. I don't think any media have done this yet, so I'll give you a tip. I wrote a communication, a long official letter about the attack on Kaj 30th of September. You have a look at it, 6 or 7 pages, and they replied with a 2 or 3 page response to all of my allegations and questions. You can find it on the UN Special Procedures website if you want to read that reply. No one much has picked that up. So there is some kind of dialogue, I would say, at least in writing. Money in return for releasing women protesters. Yeah, I've heard that too recently. I can't say I'm surprised.
Who is paying it?
Who is paying that money? Don't know. Don't know. And I don't know how much money either. Do you?
I have heard around $85,000 per woman.
I haven't heard that. That's much higher than I expected. But that's a lot. I hadn't heard that.
That's a wrong mechanism, actually. It's not about the amount of money.
Yeah,
because if they get paid, it means that they will continue arresting.
But I had not thought, I had, heard that it was families who were paying. Are you kind of suggesting that it's something more official?
Yes, that's
Yeah,
what
that I don't know about, and I can't comment on that. And then Zila, yes, I don't pretend my reports are exhaustive. I'm given a word limit. I'm allowed 10,700 words. You know, you journalists will know that's like a long article, pretty long article, but it's not a book. And so I can't include everything. So I am just giving a kind of selection and examples, emblematic cases. And when I do include something, I only do so when I've got a number of multiple reliable sources before I will report it in my reports. And I think your second question, which was about making impact, I think I answered already. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to read the online questions now. Some of them may not be relevant, but I'm going to ask it. Yeah. From each, if I'm butchering your last name or first name, what would it take for Afghan girls to access education beyond? What role could the civil society organizations, Afghan diaspora community members, and leaders around the world play to hold the current rulers in Afghanistan accountable, especially when they break human rights and exacerbate the suffering in communities across Afghanistan? So that's one. The second question is from Anne. Can you speak to the controversy about whether and what end the West is funding the Taliban, though deposits to Afghanistan through deposits to Afghanistan Central Bank? When you follow the money, how does it impact human rights? And then I have the last question here. That is from Shin Rochel. The countries that accept Taliban authorities in the embassies themselves believe in human rights and women's rights. Whether those countries can be impactful in two, right? And then the 3 questions.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just writing them down. Okay. what would it take beyond? Okay. I think regarding Majila's first question, it's not enough to reopen the schools to girls beyond grade 6. Because even if they reopen, what kind of curriculum is there going to be? Of course they should reopen. Quality education is a right of everyone without discrimination, and schools should reopen. But we also know that the curriculum is being reviewed. We know that there are schools that have been converted into madrasas, that many qualified teachers have been removed. So my point would be, sure, it's essential that schools reopen, but it's also equally essential that the education that is taught in those schools is of an international standard. This is something that is non-negotiable, and we should never accept, we should never legitimize what is completely unacceptable, which is the current situation. Then I think a second part of the question might be, well, if they don't open the schools, you know, what can be done? And I know that there are attempts to provide education remotely and so on. I don't want to talk about that too much here. I would only say that I think that that has some possibilities, but nothing is a replacement for opening schools, reopening schools with quality education. What role, how to hold the current power holders in Afghanistan accountable? For this, I think there's a lot of struggle about that, actually, because not least because of the way they took power, without any inclusiveness, and frankly, because of the withdrawal and what happened before the withdrawal with the Doha Agreement, which contributed largely to the situation now and makes it very difficult to hold accountable. What leverage do we have? I think the Taliban still want international recognition. We noticed that Mr. Mutaki wrote an op-ed in Al Jazeera last week, and you know what I read in that? He's asking for, he said, we're doing everything fine, we're not doing, you know, everything's good, so give us international recognition. So we know they want it, if the acting foreign minister is saying that. So that is something, and on the other, you know, side, they've been told, and I heard the US participating in an event this morning. It was an open event at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. I was online on girls' education, and the American ambassador in Geneva was speaking as well as me, and she said, until schools reopen, there was no chance of any recognition by the United States, at least, which is where we're sitting here, and I think a lot of countries. I talked a little bit about sanctions and other measures, and I've said, at least in general terms, that I think it needs more analysis, more creativity, thinking. We haven't seen around what pressure can be put on. The Global Magnitsky Law, I probably didn't pronounce that properly, but anyway, I think some of you will know what I mean, has not been applied. So I think more could be done on that. Anna's question, funding the Taliban through the deposits. We see around $40 million every go in cash on an airplane, and I think this has raised enormous concerns and suspicions that this money is ending up with the Taliban. The UN has defended itself in the Security Council on this and said no, it's paying for the salaries of the humanitarian workers and other officials and for the actual aid. It is the Taliban. I know others who have an analysis on this, and I think Sigar might be among that, and feel that this needs to be examined, investigated further. So I think there is so much concern about it that I agree it needs to be, there needs to be a better explanation given, at least. Ambassador Shinkai Karakil, now I can't read my own writing. Let me see what the question was. About the countries in the region that have recognized the Taliban. Opened their embassies, not recognized, but who have opened their diplomatic missions, not recognized. None have recognized, you're right. Well, I think that the region has an incredibly important role to play in terms of how they deal with the Taliban de facto authorities, especially other Muslim majority countries. They have been pretty unanimous on education for girls. That's where I see there is a commonality. I think all have spoken out about that, and I remember at the Human Rights Council earlier this month, many countries in the region spoke strongly about this issue. I've also, I want to really assure all of you that I do engage with those countries. I have met most of them and had discussions with most of them and sought their support for human rights. I think Ambassador Shinkai, you mentioned that some of them don't respect human rights themselves, but you also know, as a former diplomat, that countries can advocate for things abroad that they don't do themselves at home, and so I think we do need them to have a united front on issues that are really unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I think we are at time. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Javed Kotwal for the final words. But before doing that, I want to thank the audience. Thank you, Richard, for making time to come here to our beautiful Alexandria and meet with our Afghan community, and also for the audience online. Women for Afghan Women and Afghan American Foundation. Looking forward to many more events with you. And thank you so much.
A round of applause for our guests. So again, thank you. My name is Javed Kotwal. I'm on the board of Afghan American Foundation. Thank you for coming on a beautiful afternoon during Ramadan. Thanks to the special rapporteur for coming and giving us the time, Belquis John from UCIP for beautifully moderating. Sorry for the technical glitches and problems. Next time we're going to take care of that. We will minimize it. We cannot eliminate it. Thanks to Women for Afghan Women for hosting us here. And thanks to Tech School for the technical support. I don't know if you want to blame them or praise them. Actually, we praise them. For the efforts, we give them A. It's an Afghan-owned boot camp. It's an Afghan-owned, an Afghan-led organization, and so is Afghan American Foundation. So thank you all. One of the perks and blessings of Ramadan is we don't have to buy you drinks and food today, so we saved some money there. But again, I just want to thank you and thank everybody for making this happen. Thank you.